I think he shouldn't have been acting the way he was acting. He shouldn't have been causing problems. He shouldn't have kicked a federal agent's car 11 days previously to the shooting. But that doesn't mean he deserved to die. Folks, remember, at the end of the day, you got Tennessee versus Garner, Graham versus Connor, dictate use of force. The brain's telling him, oh, I got to stop, I got to stop, I got to stop. But the body's going, fuck you. They're still hitting me. I'm going to keep fighting. What did the agent that fired the initial round observe to make him feel that there was an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death? I'd love to know. Welcome back, folks. No chit chat. Let's get to it today. So, one word for you, Minnesota. So we know that Minnesota is a hot topic right now with the Renee Good and the Alex Pretti shootings. So we're going to do the thing a little bit different today. We're going to call it law enforcement Barney style. For me, we're going to go over some things today. I'm going to talk about use of force concerns with the Alex Pretti shooting. I'm going to go into some case law, and I'm just going to talk about some concepts and some things that I saw watching that video one time that are concerns. And I don't want to say analyze it, but I'm going to go through it after we watch the video. But the backstory here, my wife is a Mexican national who is currently in the process of getting her green card. And with the things that are going on with ICE right now and CBP, my wife is scared shitless to leave the house. Now, I tell her there's no reason to be concerned because you're doing everything the right way. You know, we paid the money, we hired the attorneys, we have our hearings, we got a hearing coming up, Social Security, all these things. And the way that these operations are being carried out right now, I have a lot of concerns with, because this directly affects my home life and my wife, with the fact that she's scared of ICE and she's scared of CBP because of seeing these videos on YouTube and Instagram and, the level of force that's being employed and people being detained at their immigration hearings and, people being detained on traffic stops and have done nothing wrong and they're legal, but, they're being given a hard time. So I feel that this is necessary to talk about. So here's the structure for today. First thing we're going to do is we're going to watch the video. This is just one of the videos. There's 1,000 out there. And this video is just the original video. We're going to watch it one time. I'm not going to say anything while we watch it. And then I'm going to go through what I got to say afterwards. But I want you to pay attention to what's going on in this video. And I want you to separate your emotions and your political parties and your beliefs in what's right and wrong and what's justified, what's unjustified, and cops are bad or cops are good. And watch the video with a clear mind and an analytical viewpoint. All right. So first thing we're going to do is watch the video. So we're going to do that right now.
People, what's wrong with you? Honestly.
I don't think we need to watch any more of that. You folks get the gist of it. You saw what's going on in that video. And there's a lot of concerns that I have with what's going on throughout the course of that video. There's a lot of scenarios that play out. There's a lot of opinions and conjecture and, this is what's going on. This is what I see. And, a lot of people are making, I don't want to say snap judgments because they're not snap judgments. These people are watching a video 27 ways from Sunday, and then they're making these analyses, if you want to call it an analysis, based off of, these second guessings and hindsights. And, I get to look at it twice so I can tell you exactly what's going on. So let's get into it. All right, folks. The first thing I want to do is talk about a couple cases that happened in the U.S. Supreme Court cases that were heard in the 80s and they're very significant to use of force review and judgment. So the first one is Tennessee versus Garner. And in Tennessee versus Garner, a 15-year-old boy was shot leaving the scene of a burglary. Now, the officers ended up shooting and killing this young man. And what came out of Tennessee Garner was a very important standard that we use in law enforcement now. And that's the deadly force standard. It used to be that a fleeing felon could be shot and deadly force was authorized. But now, after Tennessee versus Garner, deadly force was deemed to only be justified when it was necessary to prevent escape and the officer has PC to believe that the subject poses a threat of serious bodily injury or death to themselves or to the general public. And that's very important because that it puts into effect the idea that just because you run, you can't be shot. Okay. Now, the fleeing felon thing is not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is a standard. The standard of deadly force requires or is deemed legitimate when someone is fleeing to prevent escape and is a threat, or the officer has probable cause to believe that the subject is a threat of serious bodily injury or death to themselves or someone else. So remember those words: serious physical injury or death. Very, very important. Another case that was heard in front of the Supreme Court was a case called Graham versus Connor. Graham versus Connor is another use of force case. And in this case, a man is going through a diabetic incident. I think it was insulin shock, and he was acting very weird. He wasn't listening to officers' commands. He was acting kind of crazy. So the officers decided they wanted to use force. And when they used force, this guy got lumped up a little bit, got some injuries. It happens, right? Is it justified? Is it reasonable? Well, here's the question. What was the reason for force? And what force did they use? And was it reasonable, right? So out of Graham versus Connor, you get the reasonable officer standard, which is basically when excessive force cases are brought about and they're being reviewed, they're reviewed from the standpoint of, would another reasonable and objective officer in the same circumstances act the same way, do the same things, employ the same force? So you think about it this way. I'm a reasonable objective officer. I see that video or I do the investigation. And once it's done, I think that it was okay. Then it's been judged by the reasonable objective standard. Now, if it goes the other way, it's the same thing. If I deem it's not reasonable and objective, then we go further. Now, the problem with that is also it's subjective because it depends on another reasonable and objective officer's judgment, right? So not all officers are built the same. Not all officers think the same. Not all officers are trained the same. So that brings into some question in that as well, but that's not the point. The point is there's 3 criteria in using force, right, to be deemed reasonable and objective. The first is you have to take into account the severity of the crime. Is it a misdemeanor? Is it a summary? Is it a felony in progress? Is it a rape in progress? Is it a shooting in progress? Is it a stabbing in progress? Or is it some jackass pissing on the street or spitting on a car or kicking a windshield, right? Different levels, higher, lower, bigger threat, smaller threat, right? The second is they're an imminent threat to the officer or another person. So once again, that brings in, that goes right along with the severity of the crime. If, somebody squares up to you in the street and you're a law enforcement officer and, you're telling them to stop, don't move, don't move, don't move, and the guy lunges at you and punches you in the face, you can use one level above what that suspect, actor, perpetrator is committing against you. So if he's punching you, you can punch him back. If he's punching you, you can hit him with a stick. Now, other things come into account, which is a term called the totality of the circumstances. We'll get into that later, but remember that term as well. Totality of the circumstances, very important. The third criteria is if the actor is actively and assaultively trying to evade or escape apprehension, arrest, detention. So that's very simple. If they're punching and kicking you to get away, meets the criteria. So if you meet all three of these criteria, and if you take the totality of the circumstances and your force is deemed to be reasonable and objective, you should be okay. So that's Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. Look these up. They're very important because this is what law enforcement officers now, and since these cases have come out, have the responsibility to meet these standards when using force and when using deadly force. So that being said, let's get into the dirt, right? Alex Pretti. What do I think of the guy? I think he's an idiot. I think he shouldn't have been acting the way he was acting. He shouldn't have been causing problems. He shouldn't have kicked a federal agent's car 11 days previously to the shooting. But that doesn't mean he deserved to die. All things aside. Now, in this video, I'm going to attempt not to make judgments until the end. I'm going to attempt just to bring up the concerns that I have with the use of force and not judge, and just be, like I said in the beginning, a logical, reasonable person thinking from a logical, reasonable point of view. So how did it start? Well, folks, the first thing was when one of the officers, agents, whatever you want to call them, we're going to call him an agent for this video. One of the agents shoved that female in a white jacket right in front of that car down to the ground. And then another agent grabs Pretti because he's between the two and then pepper sprays him once. He tries to get away. He tries to go to the girl for whatever reason. Don't know his motivations. And then they pepper spray him again. And then guess what? It's Pittsburgh pig pile time. Let's everybody jump on this guy and dry hump him on the ground. Well, that's a judgment. I apologize. But anyway, so what's the first thing that happens? Use of force against a female and being shoved, violently shoved. What's the probable cause? What's the reason to use that level of force? Why did they push her like that? Right? Now, as we go through this, I'm going to get into this idea, this doctrine that's taught to law enforcement officers. It's called the use of force continuum. Some people call it the use of force pyramid. The department I worked with called it the use of force continuum, and it's exactly that. It's a continuum. It's a logical progression of force from lesser force to deadly force based on the totality of the circumstances, what you can and can't do, and when you can and can't do it. Now, it's just it's a blueprint because it's subjective. Every interaction is different. So it's just a cheat code for the officer to know what they are allowed to do. And then they have to figure out how to implement those steps in a logical progression, with the, exclusion of exigent circumstances, that once you take exigent circumstances into consideration, things change, but we'll get into that in a little bit. We're going to go through the video. So what was the purpose of shoving that female? It's just a question. I don't know. I want to know. I'll say it a lot. I wasn't there. I didn't see what they saw, but I want to know why. The next concern I have is, why did the agents go hands-on so quickly? It was legitimately within seconds. They're gripping up. I mean, I think it was like she hit the ground, he got in front of him, and they grabbed him right away, and they went at him hands-on. Okay. What was the goal of them going hands-on? Were there other options at that point? Were there other things they could have done? But they chose to go hands-on right away. So they have to have a goal, because when you're using force, you have a goal, you have an end goal. It's either end a threat, take somebody into custody, protect somebody from hurting themselves if they're having a medical condition, or if they're, having some type of mental distress. There's always a goal to force. And the goal to force is not to preserve the officer's pride. It's to effect a legal action to conclusion, right? So were there verbal commands given, right? What did they say to this female? And then what did they say to Pretti? You can't hear a whole lot in the videos because there's a lot of screaming and whistleblowing and all that nonsense going on in the background. But, verbal commands is basically the first level of force, paired with officer presence. Officer presence being the first, verbal commands being part of that. You could say it's the second tier of that use of force continuum. So were verbal commands being given? And if they were, how many officers were giving commands at that time? There's another idea in law enforcement that it's one voice for commands. One officer gives the commands because if you want to screw somebody's OURTO loop up in a physical altercation or in a law enforcement encounter, one of the best ways to do it is to have multiple people telling someone to do different things. So one officer could be saying, put your hands behind your back. The other officer could say, put your hands above your head. The other officer could say, hey, go down to your knees. So at that point, what are you going to do? Who are you going to listen to? Right. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, and it becomes a total mess if you got multiple people giving commands. Now, once again, the video, you can't tell. I hope they were giving commands, but if they weren't, then that's an issue, right? So here's where we're going to get into the use of force continuum. I'm going to go through it real quick, explain the levels of the department that I was trained with. Now, it may have changed since 2019 when I got out, but it's usually pretty steadfast. Things change when case law changes and somebody gets lumped up for no reason and they kind of move things around a little bit. But so I already said officer presence is the first use of force, right? Verbal commands, next level. Neither of these work. You're going to jump into what they're going to call softer techniques, which would be like pepper spray, OC, taser, things of that nature, right? Let me backtrack for a second. With verbal commands, there's come along holds, which are just gentle movements, grabbing somebody by the arm and walking them off the sidewalk. So don't forget that that's included as well. But usually that's not a big deal because it's not a aggressive use of force, right? It's a very gentle and very polite way to try to get somebody to stop doing what they're doing. So you've got officer presence, verbal commands, and then come along holds. So then once those things don't work, you go on to the softer techniques, pepper spray, taser, things of that nature, arm bars, arm locks, no chokes. Chokes aren't good anymore. None of this stuff works. Then you're going into the next level, which is going to be hard techniques, punches, kicks, batons, using whatever you have at your capability to strike someone for the most part, where you can do more damage. So it's a logical progression, right? You're nice, doesn't work. You get a little harder, it doesn't work. You get a little harder, it doesn't work. Then once you get past the hard strikes, then, this is where there's a transition into deadly force, where you're going to have things where, you do more aggressive restraint techniques, like where if you go and then you choke somebody, that's deadly force. You choke somebody, it's deadly force. You cut off air or blood, it's deadly force. Strikes to the head, deadly force. Strikes to the neck, deadly force. Strikes to the occipital lobe right here, deadly force. Firearm, of course, we know that's deadly force, right? And people don't think about these other deadly force. They just think about shootings. But, an officer could pick up a brick and use a brick as a lethal weapon if they have to. It's called a weapon of last resort, right? So I'm going to go back again. You've got officer presence, verbal commands, come along holds, softer techniques, taser, pepper spray. Then it transitions into, arm bars, things of that nature. Then you go up to the next level, which is strikes, kicks, punch, baton strikes, things of that nature. And then you go into deadly force. And then that's when you go back to the Tennessee versus Garner case where they have to be actively fleeing and posing a threat to the public or the officer. We got it? Cool. All right. So let's go back into the video where now you've got, I think it was 3 officers hands-on and another officer filling around with his pepper spray because it wasn't working. He didn't look like he knew what he was doing. He was going back and forth between the females and the other agents, and females and the other agents. So you got, I think, 4 people, maybe 5. I don't remember. I've only watched the video twice now. But they're pig piling this dude, and, they're on him and they're gripping him and they're pulling him and they're shoving him. And whether he's actively resisting or assaultively resisting, which is 2 different things. If you're actively resisting, you're just trying not to be arrested, right? Clamshelling, pulling your hands into your body, tightening up, making your body rigid so that they can't move your arms or can't control your joints. But then there's assaultive behavior, which is, actively trying to punch, kick, scratch, reach for a firearm. All these things are considered actively and assaultively resisting. So that brings up a question. Pig pile. Was Pretti, if verbal commands were being given, Was he physically capable at that time to comply with those commands? Think about it. You got 3 guys on top of you. Your human reaction, whether it's law enforcement or another person, is going to be to protect yourself. So you may put your hands over your head, you may curl up in a ball, but at that point, it's not complying with commands, right? So was he physically able to comply with any of these commands? And something people you gotta recognize is that a lot of times, I'd say 99% of the time, someone is not going to comply immediately. In a stressful situation like that, there's neurological responses and there's physical responses that will prohibit someone from stopping what they're doing like that. You know, there's going to be a slight continuation of their action because it takes a while for them to process what they're being told. So they actually have to mentally and physically understand the command, process the command, and then comply to the command. So it's not just, hey, show me your hands. No, it's show me your hands. I mean, pretty clear, right? I mean, I look like I'm having a seizure, but physical demonstrations are usually better. So let's move on. Why was the officer on the right, on the outside, that initially pepper sprayed him, smacking him in the head with a pepper spray can? Don't know. Just a question. Not saying it's right. Not saying it's wrong. I just don't know. I probably wouldn't do that because it's not very effective. It's like hitting somebody with a pop can. Just not good. Now, we go back to the resisting. I mean, at this point, he's not complying if they're giving commands, right? So was he being assaultive in nature? I don't know. I can't tell from that video, to be honest with you. I mean, just watching it 2 times, it looks like it's more of trying to pull away and get away than being assaultive. So it's definitely, if he's under arrest at this point, if he feels he's under arrest at this point and the officers feel he's under arrest at this point and he's trying to get away, then that's resisting arrest. That's a crime in itself, right? We know that. But was he assaultive? I don't know. It doesn't appear to be that way in the video, but I also haven't slowed him down. I haven't put circles and dots and done what all these other yahoos have done. Let me tell you, one video, one analysis you want to watch to get something that's completely off the wall and just makes no sense to me is the Officer Tatum. He's a former law enforcement officer out of Tucson, Arizona. He's got like 3 million followers. So, hey, listen, big dog, you say some things in there that you shouldn't say. Right around the 455-minute clip, you're like, hey, these people deserve to die and more people are going to die if they don't stop. And I'm okay with it and not cool. But anyway, that's going to be another episode where I show that video. That's going to be the next one because I think we need to address that and, mentality of police officers right now and former police officers. But back on track, firearm is a big question in this case, right? There was a firearm removed. When did the agents observe this firearm and was it communicated loud and proud that there was a gun? It sounds like on the video they're yelling gun, 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 gun. Okay, good. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to notify your partners and communicate and let them know there's a gun. So you have to determine when the gun is observed and what changes in the use of force at that point. It looked to me like everybody got a little bit more aggressive, of course, because now they're looking for a gun. They're trying to grab a gun. They don't know where it is, but they're going to really try to hold him down now. They're really going to try to not let him move because they need to find out where this gun is and stop him from having the capability physically to reach for that gun. And 2, the best case is if you can get the gun out of there and get it away from him. So when was the gun seen? And what did the agents do at that point? Did they communicate that there was a gun? Now, once again, this video isn't great, but did Pretti ever reach for the firearm? Now, from what I see in that video, up until the point it's removed, it doesn't appear that he reached for the firearm at any point. Wasn't there. Doesn't mean I'm right. I'm going by what I see in the video, and that's all I'm going by. I'm not going by anybody else's analysis or any other videos that I've seen or any other so-called expert that's out there telling you that they know the answer to what's going on and they're justifying it already or telling you it's not justified. I'm not doing that. These are just concerns that I have. So you've got the firearm scene. Did they communicate it? Did Pretti ever reach for the firearm? Good question, right? Now, you've got the agent in the back by the car that's going back and forth between the female and Pretti and the pig pile on the ground. What did he see from his point of view, right? So apparently he sees the gun. He goes down, he retrieves the firearm, and then exits the pig pile. Here's my question. Goodbye you for getting the gun out of there. Goodbye you for getting the gun out of there. I'm not shooting one of your fellow officers or shooting a bystander or shooting Pretti at that point. But did you communicate that you had the gun, saying something like, hey, no gun, no gun. I've got the gun. The gun's out of the fight. Something. Stand down, stand down. I don't care what you're saying, but are you communicating in some way, shape, or form to let the other agents know that you have that firearm? That's very important because if they don't know it's gone, it's still a threat. Gun, person, resisting, threat. Very simple. But if that gun is gone, that changes the complexity of things, right? So here's another question for you. Example. As a former law enforcement officer, when I was on duty, I carried my Glock 17 on my hip on my right side because I'm right-hand dominant. I shoot right-handed. Then I had a K-bar knife in my belt that I could reach with either hand. And then I had a K-bar knife on the inside of my right leg on my calf so that if I lost my dominant arm, I could grab that knife with my left hand and use it to defend myself or protect someone else. They call it a weapon of last resort. I called it, oh shit, everything's going bad. I'm going to have to stick a motherfucker. So I had multiple weapons. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know about general public, people that haven't been in law enforcement. I don't know if that thought ever passes through your mind. But here's a question. They get the gun. Is Pretti unarmed at that point? Do the officers know for a fact that he no longer has any weapons that he can access to cause damage, physical bodily injury, or death? You don't know. I don't think we'll know until this investigation is done. Because for one, ICE and CBP aren't going to put out anything to the public right now. And if they did, I haven't seen it yet, but I don't think they're going to say much of anything until they figure this whole thing out. So you've got the idea of multiple weapons possible, right? So now you've got the gun out of the fight. You're wondering if he communicated. You don't know if he's got any more weapons. What did the agent that fired the initial round observe to make him feel that there was an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death? What did he see? I'd love to know, but we're not going to know until this is done. It's just a question. It's something that I see that I want to know because that changes everything. Because if he sees another weapon or if he sees a gun, he might have saw the 2 magazines and thought, oh, he's got 2 more magazines. That means he's got another gun because, 1 gun, 1 extra magazine, 2 guns, another extra magazine. Maybe it's possible. So on the issue of the gun, there was a video that I saw, and if I can find it again, I'll post it on my YouTube page, my channel. It's a gentleman that has, I believe, the same model firearm that Alex Pretti was carrying that day. And he shows numerous times that with slight manipulation of the trigger, and I don't mean pulling the trigger all the way, I mean adjusting the trigger a minor bit, pulling it slightly back, and manipulating the barrel, putting pressure on the barrel and the frame, the gun fired. And we know that there's been talk that there may have been an accidental discharge somewhere. Did Pretti's gun go off when it was being removed? Why is that important, Uncle Marky? I'm going to tell you. It's important because if that firearm went off, that would be a distinct indicator to the law enforcement officers that that threat is imminent, serious bodily injury, or death. I'm going to shoot. But without that, we're talking different shit here, right? So was there a fucking discharge from Pretti's firearm? We don't know. We won't know until it's all said and done, but it's something to think about, because if there was a shot fired prior to, how are you going to know who fired the gun unless somebody says, oops, that was me? I mean, remember, folks, split-second decisions. Case law says officers can make split-second decisions in incidences of deadly force. So, moving forward, this is where we get into a little bit more of the what if, could they, couldn't have they done this instead. All this shit's going on, escalation of force rapidly, firearm, actively resisting. At any point, did these agents have a chance to take a tactical retreat, step back, reevaluate, reassess, analyze, and come up with a new plan of action? Think about it. Watch that video start to finish and count the times that it was possible that they could disengage, step back away, they could draw their firearms, they could fire a taser if they have a taser, a pepper ball, OC spray, present their firearms, because you can present your firearm on someone's person to gain compliance. It is allowed. It is allowed. Just don't shoot everybody you point your gun at. I mean, I pulled my gun many times. And, once I almost shot, I think it was a 12-year-old kid, because he had a BB gun where it was painted completely black and the orange barrel and the orange trigger were gone. And he had this gun in his hand and it was at his side and he was moving it forward. And I'm yelling at him, drop the gun, drop the gun, drop the gun. And finally he drops the gun, but I almost shot a 12-year-old kid. And I'll tell you what, I would have been justified. It would have sucked. It would have ended my fucking mental health all the way, because I never would have recovered from that. Shooting a kid? No way. But, I didn't shoot, right? And that's the thing is, these officers, they had chances, in my opinion, where they could have disengaged and pointed their gun at him and gave verbal commands or used some other type of use of force from a distance, because distance is your friend. Safety circle, folks. Safety circle. More distance you have, more time you have react. Sidetrack. For those of you who aren't law enforcement, they have what's called the 31-foot rule. It used to be the 21-foot rule, but then they deemed it wasn't a big enough distance. But basically what that rule says is a suspect with an edged weapon can get to an officer from 31 feet 95% of the time. Think about that. 95% of the time, a person with an edged weapon, a knife, a pig stick, or a cleaver, can get to an officer from 31 feet before the officer can actively and safely handle the situation. 32 foot is the minimum distance. You need 32 feet for 95% of these officers to be able to respond safely and capably to a person with an edged weapon. So think about that. That's pretty big distance, right? That's 10 yards, right? Is that right? 3 feet, 3.3 feet times. Yeah, it's 10 yards. So, that's a pretty big distance. So, why not get distance if you can in that situation? Plus, you got to take in the totality of the circumstance. You got a lot of shit going on around you, right? Like, there's people everywhere. Like, it's not I hate to say it, but it wasn't a law enforcement friendly environment. So could they disengage, take a step back, and reevaluate the situation and come back with a different plan of action? Crossfire, folks. Crossfire is like one of the biggest no-nos in law enforcement. Tactically, you never want to put another officer in a crossfire situation when you are presenting a firearm or a taser. It's not good. But think about the positioning of these officers during the shooting. You've got these guys hands-on, dry humping Pretti, and you've got the agent that decides to fires right into all of these people. To me, that's just a no-no. I mean, that's a no-no. Unless that guy's actively shooting at you or stabbing you, or perpetuating serious bodily injury at this point, I don't think you can make that shot. I don't think you can take that shot. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's very dangerous. Because not only do you have multiple law enforcement officers right there, you have bystanders. You got those two females off to the side. You probably got a ton of people around them on the outside. What if that bullet goes through and through, hits the ground, and ricochets and takes out one of the bystanders? Like, that's not good. That's just a bad scenario. So, do you shoot in that situation? I would like to say no, but once again, totality of the circumstances, not there. I can't say he's right or wrong. I'm just saying that is a very bad situation to fire a weapon. Let's keep going here. Issues that I want to just kind of reiterate and go over one more time are, why did they go hands on so quick? They immediately went hands on. It appears in the video, and continued to escalate the use of force, starting with the female getting shoved for whatever reason she got shoved. Wasn't there, don't know. Why did this level of force continue to escalate throughout the course of this encounter? Did Pretti's level of resistance change before they saw the gun? Now, after they saw the gun, things get a little different, but was his behavior becoming assaultive prior to that firearm being discovered? Did the agents jump into use of force too quick? Did they go into physical force too quick? Was there a perception of a physical threat? I don't know. Was it reasonable and objective? I don't know. I'll get into that at the end. This incident started with an unrelated use of force on the female. And I still want to know why they went after her. I don't see anything. I mean, if she was being a pain in the ass, a come along hold probably would have worked. You may have escalated it and pepper sprayed her, but they pepper sprayed and used force with, it didn't look like they tried anything else, but not there. Don't know. Were the verbal commands issued? Were verbal commands issued to Peretti to tell him to stop resisting and to behave and stop being a jerk? We don't know. Why did the agents pig pile? Pig pile never works, folks. It's you got too many bodies in there. You got too many hands in there. You got people gripping everything. One guy's grabbing a leg, one guy's grabbing this arm, two guys are trying to grab him by the throat, three guys are trying to grab the same leg. Like, it's just a total chaotic experience. And I've been in those. And listen, most of the time the officer ends up getting hurt anyway. One of them ends up getting hurt because it's just such a free for all. So why pig pile? Don't know. Was Freddie being assaultive or just resisting, being an idiot, acting like a clown? Once a firearm was removed, did they communicate it? And did anybody know that gun was gone from the fight? One of the things that could have happened, this is a what if, because everybody likes what ifs. If the officer that shot didn't see the gun was removed and didn't know that the gun was removed and sees the empty holster, would that be enough for a reasonable and objective officer to believe that there was a threat of serious bodily injury or imminent death? And I mean, think about it. The gun's gone, but you don't know where it is. It could be in Pretti's hands. It could have fallen out on the ground. You don't know. But that changes things, because if the officer that fires the initial shot doesn't know that gun is out of the fight, then their perceptions are different, right? So that's very important to think about. I think, in this whole thing, there's a complete lack of tactical awareness. It was just, it was force used without a plan. It was like, hey, you're being a dick. We're going to go hands on. We're going to get you on the ground. We're going to handcuff you. And then we're going to do what we got to do paperwork wise or whatever. But right now, you're a pain in our side. So we're going to take care of it. I mean, that's kind of what I feel about this thing right now. It's really just an ugly, 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 ugly situation. Now back to the Crossfire. Did this officer even consider where his rounds could go? I mean, as a law enforcement officer, you are responsible for every round you put down range. Every bullet you fire basically has a federal lawsuit on it. It's just the way it is. You fire a gun, you kill somebody, you're getting sued. It's the facts. You fire somebody and you miss the bad guy and the bullet hits a bystander, you're getting sued. On the human side of it, people will die. People will get hurt. It's not safe. It's not smart, and it's not tactical. And why in the world we would put ourselves in that position, I do not know. once again, I'm not here to say it's justified or it's unjustified or it's a good shoot or it's a bad shoot, but there's a lot of things going on here. And just to refresh, I'm going to go back to the case law real quick, just so you guys that didn't see it from the beginning can see what I'm talking about. But the two cases are Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. Look them up, right? Tennessee versus Garner comes up with the standard that deadly force is justified when someone is actively and assaultively trying to resist, escape, evade, arrest, and the officer has probable cause to believe that there is a threat of serious bodily injury or death, right? So the other one is Graham versus Connor, where it's got the three tiers, the three qualifications. You got to think of the severity of the crime. Is there an imminent threat to the officer or another person? And is that person actively trying to evade arrest or actively resisting, right? So there's some things that these cases recognize too. They recognize that there's no hindsight. You can't look back and go, oh, I would have done it differently. Well, you have a second to make a decision and you have a lifetime to think about it. It takes into account totality of the circumstances, not just one thing, but everything that's going on. So, there's all kinds of scenarios I could go into here, but, the bottom line is, if the officer has probable cause, then that will give them more leeway to escalate force, right? All force has to be objective, not subjective. Force has to have a goal. It has to have an end goal, what you want to accomplish through that, whether it's pushing someone away to gain distance in order to react, give yourself more space, or whether it's to get close and control that person to keep them from doing something. You have to have a goal in your use of force, and it can't be based on emotion. It can't be like, you got to remember it's a matter of human preservation, not preservation of pride. Your pride doesn't matter. Your dignity doesn't matter as a police officer. It doesn't, folks. If you think it does, you're in the wrong fucking profession, because it doesn't. At the end of the day, your job is to serve and protect property, protect people, protect life. You're not there to have a bad day and take it out on somebody, right? So, were these officers objective and reasonable? These officers have to split second. They have to evaluate, analyze, and act. They have to do these things subconsciously while they're going through a situation. And it happens very, 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 very quickly. The case law has now, they understand that officers make split second decisions and it's acceptable, right? Um, you know, there's goals to use of force. I've said it a couple times. There's goals. There's to make an arrest. There's to detain someone. There's to gain control, gain tactical distance, protect the officer, protect other people, stop a violent action, stop assaultive behavior, stop someone from fleeing from a violent crime, stop someone from hurting themselves if they're having a medical or mental break and they're cutting themselves. Things like that are acceptable times to use force, and they're just a few, but it shows that you have a goal. Like there's something you're trying to accomplish with this. You're not just using force to be a dick. And I'm not an expert. I had 12 years in law enforcement, right? I'm not an expert. I'm just a dude that saw some shit and wants to talk about it, right? So opinion time. Bottom line, this entire situation is questionable, understated beyond belief, based on what you see on the video and not the videos that come out after, the statements, what Pretti did a week ago, or what this expert thinks he did, or what this expert thought he saw, or what this expert thought the officer did. Not taking into account any of that stuff, I don't believe they were reasonable and objective. I really don't. I think they lacked a lot of good judgment and being emotionally detached and maintaining their baseline, their emotional, physical, mental baseline during this encounter. I think because, that situation is so amped up right now with all the shit going on around them that there was a lot of emotion and a lot of anger behind the actions, maybe not directed at Pretti, because, the officers that dealt with Pretti the day he was shot probably weren't the same ages that dealt with him when he kicked the car 11 days previously. So they probably didn't know who he was. right? They probably didn't know he was a problem. And if they did know who he was, does that bring in a level of concern? Like, did they go into it thinking like, this guy's a dick? We're going to fucking make him understand he can't keep doing what he's doing, and we're going to do it by using force. I hope that wasn't the way it is, but it's possible, right? Anything's possible. The agents acted too quickly with force, with physical force. They jumped into hands-on so quickly. I don't think they even had time to think about what they were doing, starting from when they pushed that female, which I still don't know why she was shoved, but they immediately went hands-on and immediately went aggressive. They're pulling them 6 different ways, trying to get them to the ground, pulling them this way, pulling them that way, pepper spraying them. Like, it was just total chaos. I think the way they approach this incident should be a training point for everyone, in that this is not how you, I don't want to say control, but this is not how you maintain the modicum of humanity in that situation. Everybody's acting crazy out there, and you have to try to keep the peace. Under the First Amendment, we have the right to speak our minds. We also have the right to peaceably assemble. 2 big words: peaceably assemble. That doesn't mean kicking cars. That doesn't mean throwing bricks. It doesn't mean punching officers while they're dealing with somebody. It doesn't mean, pushing an officer. None of that stuff. It doesn't mean you can be a total asshole, but you can get out there and you can get your point across as long as you do it peacefully. And guess what, folks? If you're in law enforcement, you know as well as I do, most times when people are out there to peaceably assemble, they don't do the things that Alex Pretti was doing. They just don't. They also don't carry a gun into a peaceful protest, and a gun with 3 loaded magazines. So that, that's 3 magazines. That's maximum damage. What are his motivations? Was he there to get even with agents for whooping him up a week and a half ago? It's possible, right? Not there. Don't know. With the exception of the possibility of a misfire of Pretty's weapon as it's being removed, and, the agent seeing the empty holster and believing that the gun was in play, actively in play, I don't think, actually, there is no reason for them to shoot. There is no reason for them to shoot at that point. They're not protecting other people. The officers are not losing this battle. They aren't losing. They're just, it's at a stalemate, So barring another weapon that is seen on him, the officer believing that the gun is in play, or that officer hearing a round go off, there's no reason they should have shot him. He should still be alive. He should be sitting in jail, crying like a little bitch about why he shouldn't have gone to that protest, and he should have listened to mommy and not done something stupid and not caused a problem, right? So once again, I'm not saying I'm not judging this a justified or unjustified shooting. I'm just saying that this is a total clusterfuck, and Pretty should still be alive. Agents got caught up in the we win mentality as law enforcement. Like, we all have it as a cop. We aren't going to lose a fight. We aren't going to lose a chase. It's just, we don't do that. At least that was my opinion. So, when you get involved in a force situation, there is a split second, and any of you out there in law enforcement know what I'm talking about. There's a split second where everything becomes clear in your mind. You're tussling with a guy, and all of a sudden it just makes sense, and you make a decision because your training and your experience is kicked in, and you just know that this is what you can do, and you do it. You may not think back on it and go, oh, I remember when I was doing this, and all of a sudden I had that moment where I said, you know what, I can do this, and this will end the fight. It doesn't happen like that in your mind, but it happens, right? Like, there's just that moment where things become clear and they slow down a little bit, and it makes sense. That's my experience. And I think most officers that have been in physical altercations will say something similar to that. This incident was doomed from the beginning. Nothing good was going to come of this from the beginning, from shoving that young lady to the ground to pepper spraying and then going hands on right away. This wasn't going anywhere good, because in the end, I don't believe the force was reasonable. I don't believe it was objective. I think ICE and CBP in Minnesota right now have what they call in law enforcement an away game. And folks, an away game is when you are not the local law enforcement and you come into a jurisdiction to do something and you do it however you want and you leave the bodies lay where they will. It happens, you know. G20 was big for that in a lot of cities where officers came in. I don't know if you remember G20, the financial summit. I think it was like 2009. Seattle burnt when they had theirs to the ground. But that was an away game for a lot of agencies. You know, the state and the counties would come in and they would lump people up, and then the locals would have to deal with the paperwork and deal with the court cases. So, you know, I think they have an away game right now where they're just out there, you know, operating with impunity. And I don't think a lot of these officers are trained well. I think that their training is lackluster at best when it comes to tactical operations on a street level. I mean, it's different if you're on a SWAT team and you're hitting a house with a warrant, right? Like there's protocols and there's procedures and there's methods, proven methods that are in place to preserve human life all the way around. Bad guy, good guys, witnesses, victims, anybody. They're in place, you know, and the same thing is in place in training for use of force and, you know, subject detention and gun retention and all these different things. And I think the training has become so stupid and so piss poor now that the goal is on getting people to not use force and to stay in that confrontation longer. And I think that's leading to a lot of problems with force and a lot of problems with excessive force. But you can't just run around and do what you want and not have accountability. You know, there's a guy out there named Dominic Izzo out of Chicago. I don't agree with a lot of the things he says, most of them, but I do agree with his stance on police accountability. And officers need to be held accountable for everything they do, good or bad. So if you screw up, if you kill somebody and it's not reasonable objective and it's not justified, you need to be charged. You need to face the court. You need to be held accountable. And guess what, folks? If you use excessive force or if you use deadly force and it's not justified, you can say goodbye to everything in your life. Your wife, your kids, your cars, your house, your finances, your sanity, and your freedom. I know a guy in the department I worked at, and he did something he shouldn't have. He went to federal prison and he suffered, but he took it on the chin like a man and did his time and came out and rebuilt his life. Now, some people won't be able to do that. It's not easy. But just remember, folks, every bullet you fire has a federal court date on it. It's just the facts, man. You got to deal with it. It's just the way it is. So, do I think it's justified? Not going to tell you. Do I think it was ugly? Yes. Do I think it should have happened? No. Do I think it could have been handled another way? I think I've given you about 30 reasons of what I think about this whole incident and how it could have been handled differently. Now, I'm not going to say I would have handled it this way or the other because I'm trying not to make a judgment here, even though I have one. So the lessons we learn, right? Don't rush into physical force. You know, utilize those soft levels of the soft and beginning levels of use of force continuum. You know, officer presence, verbal commands, come along holds. You know, they are effective. They're not going to be effective against aggressive people, but they're effective against the ones that don't want to get in trouble and don't want to go to jail, which is usually 90% of the people you deal with. Nobody wants to go to jail because it's disgusting. I didn't want to take people there. You know, if you want people to comply to verbal commands, you have to give them the opportunity to do so, right? You have to understand that they aren't going to be able to respond immediately because the neurological and physical responses are going against each other. The brain's telling them, oh, I got to stop, I got to stop, I got to stop. But the body's going, fuck you. They're still hitting me. I'm going to keep fighting. So we have to give them the time to adjust their behavior, right? I think that's very important. The human instinct is for someone to defend themselves. Just the way it is. Cop, no cop, is to defend themselves. And you have to break through that mental block as a law enforcement officer to get them to hear what you're saying and listen to what you're saying and then act on it. So give them some time, folks. Don't get yourself shot. If it's a lethal force encounter, don't get yourself shot. But just keep that in the back of your mind. Verbal commands will stop action if the person is not an idiot and if they're not just being a dick. So work on your verbal commands, folks. Clear, concise, loud, authoritative. Make yourself heard. Make sure they understand you. So officers can make shit worse. Officers can put themselves in a situation of officer-induced jeopardy. It's something else that Dominic Izzo talks about. An officer can make a decision or put himself in a position where they've just increased the potential for lethal force. It's possible. It happens. I don't think it's intentional across the board, but I think people make bad decisions as law enforcement officers and put themselves in bad situations where they've kind of handcuffed themselves to where now, hey, guess what? I can't use the rest of this shit. I got to go straight to the gun. And we don't want that to happen. So, you got to keep that stuff in mind. Use of force continuum. You got to live by it, folks. You can jump levels if there's exigent circumstances. If someone makes a drastic change in their behavior to escalate the use of force, you can skip levels to get to the force that's going to be effective. You can always go one level above what they're doing as long as you can justify it and articulate it. If you can't justify it, don't do it. So if I'm dealing with a guy and he punches me in the face and I punch him back and he pulls a gun, I can go right to lethal force at that point. I don't have to continue what I'm doing. Understand? Cool. Training is lacking. That's end of story. Training is lacking. Departments don't pay for it. They don't want it. They don't care. Officers need to be always in control of their mental, emotional, and physical condition. You need to maintain a baseline. Maybe check out my man, Joe Swanson Tactical. He does some training on that. Really good dude. He works on officers, ways to get back to your baseline so you don't act out of emotion and out of anger and out of frustration, and you are maintaining your mental, physical, and emotional baseline. I think that's very, very important. And he's a great guy. He gives a lot of good information. I did a podcast with him a few weeks ago. But yeah, folks, I probably missed some things here. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this. So please let me know what you think. All my socials are either under SC Roundtable or Steel City Roundtable. Email is steelcityroundtable@gmail.com. Website is steelcityroundtablepodcast.com. And my personal phone number is 724-759-8600. So folks, remember, at the end of the day, you got Tennessee versus Garner, Graham versus Connor, dictate use of force for law enforcement officers and its application and its reasonableness and objectiveness. Don't be a hothead. Don't get tied up in the moment of the we win and I'm gonna make you do this because I say so mentality. At the end of the day, you're there to serve and protect. And the goal is to preserve human life above all else. Lethal force should only be employed when it has to be, when there is a imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death as perceived by you, the law enforcement officer. You got to have it. You can't just go willy-nilly firing rounds off. I know I talked about a lot of things today and I kind of went fast, but I got to go to work. So, I'm trying to get this done and get this to you folks. But yeah, I think this is a horrible incident. I think this never should have happened. I think that at the end of the day, there's going to be some issues with the outcome of this, justified, unjustified. Personally, I think it's going to be justified. That's not what I think. That's not how I feel. But, based on the circumstances and based on not being there, I think it's going to be justified through, the investigation. And I don't know if it should be justified or not justified. I don't have all the facts. But based on what I saw in that video, I think there's going to be some issues with the call at this in the end of the day. But for my civilian friends, thanks for checking us in. Hopefully you liked my first installment of Law Enforcement Barney Style. I'm going to be coming out with some more of the stuff. I got a whole bunch of other stuff to talk about. I've been writing shit down for like 3 weeks. And for my law enforcement friends, first off, Homewood, baby. Zone 5, Fighting 5th, Medic 1, Fire Department over in Zone 5. I love you guys. You're some of the best people I ever worked with. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep the people safe. Get home safe. And remember our fallen. And to the rest of you folks that are in law enforcement, remember at the end of the day, your job isn't to be judge and jury. Your job is to gather the facts and make a decision based off of the information you have in front of you, whether or not a crime has been committed and whether or not somebody needs to be arrested, cited, detained, whatever. Leave your emotions at home. You know, whether your dog shit on your boots or your wife cheated on you with your best friend or your kid failed out of school, I don't care. You leave that shit at home, because at the end of the day, you need to be at baseline when you're on that job, because shit changes by the second and you have to be ready for it. And you always have to keep in the back of your mind that your job is to serve and protect. And the most important thing is to preserve life at all costs and use deadly force only when it has to be used. Because I'll tell you what, folks, I don't think you want to deal with a body on your hands. I think that's a tragedy for everybody involved. So thanks again for joining in, and love you all. Till next time.